Hi, hello, welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Jess. I'm frustrated and I'm sure a lot of people can understand. Like, nothing is going right. I have this massive pimple right here. My hair is uneven. Nothing fits me correctly. But that's not what we're here for. We're here for these books. So maybe just don't look at me. Just listen. I was trying to come up with some like catchy intro and I really just don't have the energy for that. I'm really tired. I think a lot of you are tired, angry, frustrated, panicking, spiraling, and valid, very valid. I think since this is primarily a book channel, that the only thing I know to do is to give you some recommendations. Will these books make you feel better? Probably not. They're probably gonna make you angrier, but I think at least anger with knowledge is better than just anger. And who knows, maybe you read one of these things and you're inspired to do something, go into public policy, go into something different. I don't know. I just have read these over the last several years and have never like done a recommendation video. One, because I really don't think I'm good at it, but here we go. And maybe I'll make another one. These books that I have 6 books, and they do a good job at explaining how we got here. As in here, I mean as the United States of America as it is today. This is not an exhaustive list. It does not cover all of the wrongdoings this country has done to the people, and it does not cover all marginalized groups. These books are primarily focused on America's treatment of Black people here. And again, I've read a lot of these because of I'm a Black woman, obviously. And so I've read a lot more of these. I have read some other, but my knowledge is more limited, which I would like to expand on in the future. But if you have recommendations, for example, on the history of America with indigenous groups, a history of America with queer people, all of those things, again, I don't have the breadth of knowledge. I'm also not the end all the end all be all on this topic in general. If you watch my channel and maybe you do want some nonfiction recommendations, here are some. I will do my best to give, not just read off the back of the book, but some of these I haven't read in a while, but I pulled them off my shelf. I own them because I think they're valuable to go back to, because I do not own every one that I have read. And so without further ado, I will get into the recommendations. I will say last thing that the majority of these are by the authors are Black, but there are 2 where they are not, and I will tell you, including my first one, which is The Color of Law. This is by Richard Rothstein, and this is a forgotten history of how our government segregated America. I believe I read this as a buddy read a couple years ago. I read it with Elliot Brooks, I read it with Monet, and was it just us? Was Jashana? Did Deshaun also read with us? Fellow booktubers did a buddy read, and this was enraging, to say the least. Like I said, that's going to be a theme here for all of these books. But a lot of the things in this book, a lot of terms I had heard about and knew a little bit about, but this really goes into the history, especially like redlining. And so I'm sure if you live in America, in a lot of cities, this is not everywhere, but in a lot of cities that are essentially segregated still today. And this explains how that happened. And he goes through what he says. He describes how federal, state, and local governments systematically impose residential segregation with undisguised racial zoning, public housing that purposely severed previously mixed communities, subsidies for builders to create whites-only suburbs, tax exemptions for prejudiced institutions, and support for violent resistance to African Americans in white neighborhoods. But yeah, so he talks about basically like this wasn't some accidental thing, or this wasn't just like we want to stick together, we're going to stay over here and the white people stay over there. This was government mandated. Okay, even when there were Black people who were making more money and could afford to move into these middle class neighborhoods, and how they did things to prevent that. Or when they did come in there, how other people, the white people in the neighborhood, would suddenly be selling their houses and leave, something called white flight. So it goes into all of that, and it's just, again, very infuriating when you learn about the laws and all of the different things they did to put Black people in various areas or keep them away from white people. And just also, not even just the government and how regular white people acted, of course, which we know, trifling, but I think there is a lot to learn in here. And this is, I think when I read it, I just listened to the audiobook before I had a physical copy. And this is something I do want to reread and tab to have better notes about what happened. But again, this one was not by a Black author, but this is really great. So I think this is a must read. Another book that I obviously am recommending here is Mediocre by Ijeoma Oluo. Now this is the dangerous legacy of white male America. Very, very poignant, very, very topical, very timely. I thought this was really interesting because, as the title says, mediocre, I think that is a great descriptor for our current government. Actually, dare I say, mediocre is giving them a lot. But this says, what happens to a country that tells generations of white men that they deserve power? And that is literally the people we have now, that they're like, I am a white man, especially a straight, cisgender Christian white man. What happens when their identity is defined by their status over women and people of color? And so she goes through that history. Also, I think another big one thing that sticks with me in this book is like Bernie bros. So people who are really team Bernie, how easily they went over to be Trump voters. But it all comes back to this, how this country has I want to say fooled, but how they've just indoctrinated white men, especially with thinking that like white men know all and deserve all, regardless of, you know, if they actually merit it. We don't live in a meritocracy, as most of us know that, but they like to claim so, even though they don't have the merit to be in a lot of positions that they're in. So this is really great. Let's see, I have some tabs in here. I love when I remember to write what the tabs are. So I'm going to try to go to a quote and just give you, see if I can find a good one. Whiteness is not only threatened when it takes on too many traits of identities of color, it is also threatened when communities of color cease to stay below whiteness, where society's scripts say they belong. A white family may feel threatened not only when their daughter brings a black man home for dinner, breaking from what is expected of her as a white person, but also if that black man makes the same wage as her father, breaking from the expectations of blackness that whiteness depends on. The same is true for masculinity. Men may feel threatened not only when their sons declare their love of the color pink, but also when their daughters choose monster trucks over dolls. But this, you're gonna be mad, but it does a great job at just explaining a lot of how we got here, especially when you look at the people in these positions of power and you're like, I have just as much knowledge, experience, if not more so than you in these areas, and yet you are in these high positions of power. And so it will make you scream, but again, I feel like anger and knowledge is better than just anger. I hope. Ooh, another! I mean, I feel like they're all timely because they explain how we got here. But anyway, the new Jim Crow, this is a 10th anniversary edition, which I think has a foreword. I forgot. I think there's a preface that was added into the 10th anniversary edition. Okay, yes, the 10th anniversary was in 2020. Yeah, Michelle Alexander is a highly acclaimed civil rights lawyer, advocate, and legal scholar. So the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration in the age of color blindness, because you know, people don't see color. Somebody on the back says devastating. Correct. This really explains to you, if you've seen 13th, the documentary, I think that was on Netflix, I think you can watch that before or after, but this is like definitely more in depth, but explains how the 13th Amendment, when they got rid of slavery, they kind of just wrote it in a different form of slavery, and that is mass incarceration, and of course how that overwhelmingly affects Black and Latinx, specifically men, but still just Black and Latinx people more than white people. And people will say like, oh, well, blah, 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 this many white people in prison. That is not saying that white people are not also affected by this system. It's a bad system overall. But this goes into how, if you think about proportions, the percentage of the population that we make up, that we are overwhelmingly more likely to be incarcerated. And she also talks about the vicious cycle of incarceration. It's not just you go to prison, you get out, and you can go back to your normal life. It's not that easy. She also talks about kind of just like the pipeline from school systems into the prison industrial system. And it's just disheartening isn't the word. Enraging is more like it. Again, sadly, this is one that I listened to on audio and then bought the physical after, so I don't have notes, but I want to reread it. But it is just yeah, it just explains how the system works, and how the likelihood of once you're in the system, it's gonna be really hard to get out of that, and what they do, and how that's basically legal slavery. Because I forget if she goes into it in this book, but a lot of people who work in who are in the US prison system are working for manufacturers, for companies, if they're making anything, it's literal change per hour per day for these multi-billion-dollar companies. I mean, for a very present day example, the fires in California, a lot of those firefighters are incarcerated. And I will look it up if I can find something, because I don't know if they're getting paid. If they are, it's very little. I even heard that they're not even like guaranteed, like they may do this firefighting service while they're incarcerated. That is not like a guarantee, or it's not something that can help them become a firefighter on their way out. It's just like, they say that prison is supposed to be reformed, right? People are supposed to go and they're supposed to learn from their mistakes, and they're supposed to come out better, and how that is not true. That is not what this system is made for. It is made to be a modern, legalized form of slavery. And if you are paying any attention to anything that's going on now with ICE raids and things like that with people who have immigrated to this country, well, the last two are medical focused, but this one is a big chonker. Again, I listened to before I had the physical. I have regrets. Now, people have mixed feelings about Ibram X. Kendi, and he's not like this perfect person, right? I think we have to stop expecting perfection from everybody. People have their problems. I still think this is a good book, and there are various levels. This is the adult one, stamped from the beginning. I think there is both. I think there's a young adult and maybe a children or middle grade version, so like they break it down easier. I think this is one of the more dense ones on this list, but this is the definitive history of racist ideas in America. And I thought this was one of the first nonfiction books I read when I was really getting into nonfiction beyond memoirs. And so this one did take me a little longer to read, because I mean, it's going back through history and really some things, basically things that you were taught in the United States education system. And this is coming from me as a millennial, and I know that the education system is completely different, especially depending on what state you live in, on what they're going to tell you about the history of the country, about slavery, about those things. Because what is it, Florida, Ron DeSantis, they say that they have to include in their curriculum that slavery gave people skills for life, transferable skills or something crazy. So even before the education system was as terrible as it is now, the amount of information that I remember learning about Black history was already small. And it definitely took from like highlights of where everyone's like, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. You know, you just had those little sound bites, and this really just goes into all of that, but into more and deeper on like what actually was happening in our country. So I feel like this is a really good history book. So again, it's gonna be more dense, and I wish I had more specific examples to tell you about, but I do think if you're wanting to go back and really study history, I forget what time frame he goes through. Okay, this is Stamped from the Beginning narrates the entire history of racist ideas from their origins in 15th century Europe through colonial times, when the early British settlers carried racist ideas to America, all the way to the 21st century and current debates about the events taking place on our streets. So, and then there's like 5 main characters will serve as our tour guides as we explore the landscape of racial ideas through 5 periods in American history. So yes, I again think this quote, a deep and often disturbing chronicling of how anti-Black thinking has entrenched itself in the fabric of American society, not solely through ignorance, but through a rationalization of inequity in institutional practices. It's been here, and this will tell you how. Okay, the last 2 again said are medical focused. And so this one was not written by a Black author because this is a biography. This is The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and I recently read this, maybe last year. I know this was made into a film on HBO. I didn't watch that, but I think a lot of people have heard about this because she is the woman they took the cells from that became these HeLa cells. That's why the immortal life, because the cells are still alive. Doctors took her cells without asking. Those cells never died. They launched a medical revolution in a multi-million-dollar industry. More than 20 years later, her children found out their lives would never be the same. I don't know much about Rebecca Skloot, who wrote this. So I don't know if there's like tea about her, because there's always something about somebody, okay? I didn't look into that. This is so frustrating. Again, I feel like I don't have the vocabulary to explain how enraging these things are. But again, her name was Henrietta Lacks. Scientists know her as HeLa. And she was a poor Black tobacco farmer whose cells taken without her knowledge in 1951 became one of the most important tools in medicine. And she didn't know, she died very young. Her family didn't know for years. You get to learn about her upbringing, her life, her short life, unfortunately. And then the lives of her descendants and how much they suffered financially and how these companies benefited. Obviously, it helped scientifically, like they made a lot of discoveries and are still using them today, but that her family struggled like their entire lives when these cells were making all of this money, and it just was really heartbreaking to just see the generations of suffering when these corporations, like, so it was vital. Her cells have become vital in the development for the polio vaccine, for cloning, gene mapping, and more. They've been bought and sold by the billions, yet she remains virtually unknown, and her family can't afford health insurance. And this, while this focuses on Henrietta and again her family and her cells, it does give a little bit about some other doctors and just the shady shit they were doing. If you've read anything, the next book will really go into this. But this one part I tabbed said, like many doctors of his era, Talend often used patients from the public wards for research, usually without their knowledge. Many scientists believe that since patients were treated for free in public wards, it was fair to use them as research subjects as a form of payment. And as Howard Jones once wrote, Hopkins, with his large indigent black population, had no dearth of clinical material. I don't recall if it's in, I'm so sorry, if it's in the New Jim Crow or if it's in the next book or if it's just from something else I read, but I know that they also would test on prisoners because they're like, well, you're locked up here, what, and you know, be like, well, you can do this thing and maybe you'll get out earlier. Just always taking advantage of people. This is another story about a physician who loaded a syringe with saline solution mixed with the HeLa cells. So these are malignant cancer cells, and he would, in this instance, he slid the needle into the forearm of a woman who'd recently been hospitalized for leukemia, then pushed the plunger, injecting about 5 million of Henrietta cells into her arm. Using a second needle, Southam tattooed a tiny speck of India ink next to the small bump that formed at the HeLa injection site. That way he'd know where to look when he re-examined the woman days, weeks, and months later to see if Henrietta's cancer was growing on her arm. He repeated the process with about a dozen other cancer patients. He told them he was testing their immune systems. He said nothing about injecting them with someone else's malignant cells. It's just, again, you're going to be fucking mad. But I think it's important history because we talk about the advancement of science and the wonders that people have discovered. But we got here with all of the advancements we have with cancer, with gynecological studies, a lot of that on the backs of marginalized people, on the backs on the bodies of Black people unwillingly, of people who were imprisoned, enslaved, all of this unwillingly, or they're coerced into it. They really did not have any position or wherewithal to say no. So it's like, yes, we can marvel at science, but we should know the cost of it. Which goes into my last recommendation, which is Medical Apartheid, which is definitely one of the hardest nonfiction books that I've read, but it is, God, it's so worth it. It took me some time to get through this one. Look at all my tabs. Oh, look, I have my notes. But this is by Harriet A. Washington, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Time to the Present. And I did a video discussing this, and I can link that. But this, again, this is gonna go, I definitely think this one talks about the history of gynecological studies. I think this one touches on studies done on people in prison. But this, I think the only downfall to this book is it was written in 2000 or published in 2006. And so I think that like an updated version would be really cool because of all of deaths that we're seeing amongst specifically Black women in giving birth. How as a best country or this industrialized developed nation, our maternal rates, our death rates are increasing. So I think that's the only downside, is that this came out, yes, this was published in 2006, and so obviously that's almost 20 years ago. Oof. And so I would love like an updated version talking about the current afflictions that we're facing. But again, we're talking about medical exploitation on the plantation, antebellum medical experimentation with slaves in freedom, displays of Black bodies, anatomical dissection and display, what really happened at Tuskegee, the eugenic control of African American reproduction, research on Black prisoners, radiation experiments on African Americans. Like, it is not a light read at all. I definitely think, along with Stamped, this is one of the more dense ones, and you know, the text is smaller, but I highly recommend this one. Again, like I said with the previous one, that we can be appreciative and marvel at science because it is incredible how far we've come, but we have to acknowledge the sacrifice of the people who had to be unwilling participants in these experiments. And I can't even process the thought of that. Like, it's making me, I just think about when I have cramps or something and I'm in pain, and that is just my body doing something naturally, and then I can seek help. But just to think about the things that people had to suffer most of the time with no kind of anesthesia, and again, against their will, because we were seen as less than and just as these perfect candidates for experimentation, it's really hard to read about, but again, very important. I think that too often, I think being alive, being raised during these modern times, we try to divorce ourselves from the reality of something that was not that long ago. And again, what's it's not cliche because it's true. You don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. And although I do think that a lot of people do know this history and they're repeating it anyway, us as the majority, if we know these things, we can start spotting the patterns and the signs to hopefully they don't happen again. Which is crazy in our current environment. It seems like a lot of things are on their way to happening again.
You said the following, and I quote, "We should not be giving Black people the same vaccine schedule that's given to whites because their immune system is better than ours." Can you please explain what you meant?
There's a series of studies, I think most of them by Poland, that show that to particular antigens that Blacks have a much stronger reaction. There's differences in reaction to different products by different races.
So I have 17 seconds left. Let me just ask you then. So what different vaccine schedule would you say I should have received? What different vaccine schedule? should I have received?
I mean, the Pollen article suggests that blacks need fewer antigens.
This is so
you
dangerous.
get the same measles vaccine.
Mr. Kennedy, with all due respect, that is so dangerous. Your voice would be a voice that parents would listen to. That is so dangerous. I will be voting against your nomination because your views are dangerous to our state and to our country.
And I just feel very fearful if people are only getting their information from a TikTok. And I love TikTok, a YouTube video. And like, all of these things are great, but I think you need multiple sources and not even just one nonfiction book. Like, when they have their sources in the back, looking some of those up sometimes, like, I just really worry about everyone because of the things that are happening and the things that we like to forget. So I will have all these written in the description. Again, this is not an extensive list. These are just a few that I pulled off my shelves this morning, and I would love if you have any other recommendations in the comments to share with other people and for me, because I do want to get back into nonfiction. But I just want you to have be in the right headspace when you go into these, because these can just tank your energy, your happiness. You know, maybe you got to put it down. It's not something you have to fly through. I think this took me weeks to read, and that's fine. And I just think, well, I don't know an exhaustive list of banned books, but who knows what information they may try to ban. They may try to ban things like this. Right now it's a lot of fictional works, but who knows. So I just think we can be angry and we can be worried, but we should also try to be informed as possible. It's a difficult balance. But again, I recommend all of these. And if you haven't read any of these, I hope you give one a try. So thanks for watching. Stay blessed, hydrated, moisturized, and sunscreen. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.